Hello and welcome back to the final episode of our individual draft player breakdowns for the 2026 quarterback class. Today we're going to be talking about Behren Morton, quarterback out of Texas Tech. Morton was originally a guy I wasn't planning to evaluate. I didn't feel like there was much there from his season that was worth looking at, but he did go in the 7th round to the Patriots, so I figured let's take a look. Let's see what the Patriots saw in him and see if I agree or disagree with that. Morton had a tough end to his season after a really exciting year for Texas Tech. He, led them to one of their more successful seasons they've had in recent history that culminated in a playoff berth for them. Tough ending to their year. Oregon just dominated them 23-0 in their playoff game where they got eliminated. And Morton really struggled in that game. And the overall Texas Tech offense really struggled in that game to the point where I think most people kind of wrote him off from a draft perspective, but I do think there's some interesting stuff here with Morton. He was playing on a broken leg this year, so some of the mobility and even like throwing power that you might come to expect from him was certainly limited. He also was limited with a shoulder injury in another season, so there's a lot of complexity and just interesting things to look at with him. Where if you start to talk yourself into the upside with him, I can see why a team decided he was worth spending a draft pick on. So let's get into some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses with him. Morton, 6'2", about 220, pretty physically impressive player. He moves pretty well for a guy his size, and you can tell that he is a pretty talented thrower of the ball in general. He's able to throw without needing to really step into a throw. He can hop around in the pocket and quickly get a throw off. He's got a very quick release. I think he's one of the more smooth throwers on the run in this draft, and a guy that can really be rolling to his right and still, make a throw out to the sideline. He's got enough arm talent where even rolling to his left, he can still kind of make some interesting throws from there. And he moves well enough where that's a real part of his game. I wouldn't describe him as much of like a scrambler or a quarterback runner, but he does have the ability to extend plays and try to make throws from that point. He has that ability to throw on the run. He also is a pretty good, just in the pocket, simple line drive thrower. You see that on his tape pretty consistently. And because his throwing ability is pretty good, he's very willing to test throwing into tight windows, even after kind of the initial progression or his first read. He looks at broken plays as an opportunity to still pick up yardage. One of the ways where I think he actually excels in that is he does find hidden yards on plays where a guy might be open 3-4 yards down the field, and most guys would kind of just dirt it out of bounds. But he has the arm talent where he will fit throws into some tight windows there and allow his offense to stay ahead of the chains. So overall, I think Morton's strengths come from the different ways he can throw the ball, both in the pocket, outside the pocket, some of the creative plays he can make there, and his ability to continue to fight for yards later in the down. There's a lot of give and take in Morton's game, however, and I think that's a good place for us to transition into some of the weaknesses. Morton creates some of his own plays, but he also runs into a ton of his own mistakes. He is a drifter in the pocket about as much as anybody you'll watch. He loves taking deep drops. Like, he'll just continue to back up, give himself even more time. And you saw it like against some of the worst teams that they played. So like Oregon State, I think, was one of the games. He can just stand back there forever. And his arm's good enough where he doesn't really need the extra 5 yards. Like, he can make a throw from 10, 15 yards behind the line of scrimmage. And it works. It's very effective. It gives him his receivers time to get open down the field. But then when you see him do that against Oregon, it's like, oh yeah, these edge rushers now can just run straight at you, right? It turns the game into a completely different equation. And so I do think that's something he'll have to kind of get out of the habit of. One of my worst case comps for him speaks to a lot of these issues that I see, which I'll hit on that in a little more detail later. In general, along with like the pocket drifting, I would say in general, he just runs backwards to escape pressure way too much. He gives ground. He tries to scramble when he should be throwing the ball away. He'll take a sack when he should be throwing the ball away. There's a ton of big negative plays on his tape that are not worth the risk that he is putting himself in at that point. He has very little feel for pressure. There's so many times where you see him try to make a throw or try to get a throw off when there's too much pressure around to risk a fumble or some sort of batted ball. He really struggles with that, and I think that in general his risk reward I think is just off, especially for a team that was really talented in this year and didn't need him to be the hero, right? Like most of the games, they were way more talented than who they were playing. I don't know that he really understood that to the extent that would have been helpful for their offense. On top of that, he makes pretty poor decisions, I think, at times, given the game situation and time. Like you see him do those types of things, even when they're up, even in situations where it doesn't really call for that. Another thing that in general I think that concerns me about Morton is the decision making. He, in general, will just kind of make some bonehead decisions, like just stare right at a covered receiver and try to attempt to throw. I question sometimes how well he's seeing the field because he uses a ton of pump fakes, and some guys use pump fakes like Mahomes to like bait the defense into something. With Morton, it feels more like he's still deciding whether or not he wants to throw the ball and then makes a really late decision to accommodate for that. And that is something that concerns me from a processing perspective. It causes him to be late sometimes. The last thing I want to hit on with Morton, and this is something that I've come to realize over the last few years that is something that shows up as a red flag for me in quarterback play, is if you are a guy that is pretty good between the 20s and then in the red zone, you fall off a cliff, which I'm not 100% sure statistically what that looks like for Morton this year, but you saw it in the Oregon game for sure. Those guys scare me because really what the red zone struggles are suggesting is once the windows get tighter, once you can't rely as much as on your athleticism and your receivers to create space for you, you struggle to see the field and you struggle to make quick decisions. You struggle to avoid turnovers and risking yourself out of a field goal. All of those things I think concern me with Morton. And I mean, the guy that fit this bill the most last year is a guy that's returning to college in Marcel Reed from Texas A&M. You watch the Miami game, they move the ball pretty well. They get down to about the 30 or the 20-yard line, and then they can't do anything. And it's because Miami is just begging Marcel Reed to make a mistake in the red zone, and he did it plenty of times in that game. Those guys scare me, especially projecting to the next level, because you're just going to be in more of those situations at the NFL level than you were in college. There's not as much space. The field's not as wide open. Your receivers aren't going to be twice as good as everybody else that you're playing against most weeks. So all of that, for me, does present some red flags with Morton. I think he has some of the highest highs and lowest lows you'll see of anybody on tape this year. There are plays where he looks like he has first-round caliber ability, and then there's plays where it's like, this is just not going to work. One interesting note that also kind of caused me to want to take a look at Behren Morton in more detail is Chris Sims is really high on him, guy that, played in the NFL, loves evaluating quarterbacks and ranking them, all that kind of stuff into draft season. So I was curious what caused him to be so interested in him. And then as I was watching him and thinking about comps, I was trying to think of, best case, worst case, and the guy I could not get out of my head that I was watching was Zach Wilson. And part of it is because Morton wears number 2, so it's like in your head, the number comparison thing is just so easy. But the same super deep drops, the talented arm, Wilson's arm was much better than Morton's. Like Wilson had an awesome arm, but some of the mental mistakes, some of the timing concerns, all that sort of stuff, the red flags on Morton's tape are the same red flags you saw on Zach Wilson's tape. So it's interesting to me because Chris Sims was super high on Zach Wilson, had him as his number 1 quarterback that year. This feels like a guy that's kind of in that archetype where like some really high highs, pretty talented arm, but then there's just some questionable decision making there. And obviously Morton is nowhere near the prospect that even the people who were low on Wilson had him as, a second round guy, whatever. Like this, we're not talking about that here, but just a similar archetype of player. So that would be my worst case for Morton, is a guy like that. I put my best case for Behren Morton as Drew Lock. I think there's, similar to Lock, I think there's too much ugly on his tape to fully convince me he'll ever be good enough to be a starter. But there are enough high-end traits where I think he can be a pretty high-end backup if everything comes together and if the injuries start to fade with him, which has been a concern in college. So Morton's an interesting player. I enjoyed watching his tape more than I thought I would, and I see why the Patriots took spent a 7th round pick on him. I ended up with a 7th round grade on Morton for some of the risk reward reasons. I think it's probably worth a dart throw, but I'm not really confident he ever turns into something. So I have a 7th round grade on Morton, and that is where we'll end for today. So that'll do it for the last individual player breakdown episode of the 2026 quarterback class. Thanks for listening to all of these. If you have, feel free now. The playlist should pop up, so go back, watch all the other ones if you are curious to see about any of the other players and their evaluations. And we should be back soon with one final ranking summary, and in addition to the ranking summary, talking about team fits for all of these players and who we think ended up with a good team fit, who was maybe put in a more difficult position from this 2026 class. So thanks for watching, and we'll be back with one more episode soon.